There's a particular kind of loneliness that does not come from being alone. It comes from being unseen. When a child grows up in an environment where their emotions are not mirrored, not welcomed, not acknowledged, something profound happens. The child does not stop feeling. In fact, they feel even more, but instead of expressing those feelings, they turn their sensitivity outward. They begin to read the room. They study faces. They anticipate tension before it erupts. They become exquisitely attuned to the emotional states of others. This is not a personality trait. It is an adaptation. The empath, who grew up unseen, learned very early that their own feelings were too much, or inconvenient, or unsafe. Perhaps there was a stressed parent, a depressed caregiver, or emotional unpredictability in the home. The child, in their innocence, makes a decision: if I can understand everyone else, maybe I will belong, maybe I will be loved. And so hyper-attunement becomes survival. But survival strategies do not disappear in adulthood. They become identities. The unseen child grows into the adult who is deeply compassionate, endlessly supportive, and often exhausted. They know how to hold space for everyone else, yet struggle to articulate their own needs. They can sense subtle emotional shifts in a conversation, yet feel confused when asked, "What do you want?" because no one ever asked them that before. Over time, the nervous system pays a price. When we suppress our authentic emotions to maintain connection, the body carries the burden. Chronic tension, anxiety, autoimmune conditions, digestive issues, these are not random malfunctions. They are signals. The body speaks when the voice has been silenced. The empath who grew up unseen often feels responsible for other people as discomfort. They apologize for taking up space. They say yes when their body is screaming no, and beneath their kindness is a quiet fear: if I stop giving, will I still be loved? This is the wound of invisibility. Yet here's the paradox. The very sensitivity that once protected them is also their gift. Empathy is not the problem. Self-abandonment is. Healing does not mean becoming less sensitive. It means turning that sensitivity inward. It means noticing the tightening in the chest before agreeing to something that feels wrong. It means allowing anger to be information rather than shame. It means grieving the childhood where one had to earn connection by disappearing. Compassion must begin with the self. When the unseen child is finally acknowledged, when their anger, sadness, and longing are welcomed without judgment, something shifts. The nervous system softens. The compulsion to rescue diminishes. Boundaries no longer feel like rejection, they feel like protection, and authenticity begins to replace performance. The lifelong effect of growing up unseen is not weakness. It is a profound capacity for awareness. But awareness without self-compassion becomes self-erasure. So the invitation is gentle but courageous, to ask yourself, perhaps for the first time, what do I feel? What do I need? To tolerate the discomfort of disappointing others. To understand that love does not require self-betrayal. You were never too sensitive. You were perceptive in an environment that required vigilance. And now, as an adult, you have a choice that you did not have as a child. You can stop abandoning yourself in order to be seen. Because the deepest healing for the empath who grew up unseen is this: to finally become visible to themselves. The invisible child does not grow up in isolation. They grow up surrounded by people who are physically present but emotionally unavailable. Their basic needs may have been met. There may have been food on the table, clothes in the closet, perhaps even laughter in the house. But something essential was missing. No one truly saw who they were beneath their behavior. No one consistently mirrored their inner world back to them with curiosity and care. A child does not need perfection. A child needs attunement. They need a caregiver who notices the tremble in their voice, the shift in their eyes, the subtle withdrawal when something hurts. When that attunement is absent, the child does not conclude that the environment has failed them. The child concludes that something is wrong with them. This is where invisibility begins. The invisible child quickly learns that expressing sadness may overwhelm a stressed parent. Showing anger may lead to rejection or punishment. Displaying excitement may be ignored or dismissed. So the child adapts. They begin to edit themselves. They soften their voice. They swallow their tears. They become agreeable. They become helpful. They become easy. And beneath that compliance lives a nervous system in survival mode. Because when a child feels unseen, their body does not feel safe. Emotional neglect is not loud. It is quiet and chronic. It is the absence of being asked, what happened? It is the absence of comfort when something frightening occurs. It is the subtle but repeated message that connection depends on performance. The invisible child becomes hyper-aware of others. They scan facial expressions. They track tone shifts. They anticipate needs before they are spoken. This is not manipulation, it is protection. If they can keep the environment stable, maybe they can prevent further disconnection. In this way, empathy is born from necessity, but what is sacrificed in the process is the child as authentic self. When you are constantly focused on managing the emotional climate around you, you lose contact with your own internal weather. You may not know when you are hungry, tired, hurt, or angry. You only know when someone else is. Over time, this disconnection becomes identity. The invisible child often grows into the adult who is praised for being mature beyond their years, responsible, wise, understanding. They carry burdens that were never theirs. They mediate conflicts between adults. They offer comfort to caregivers who should have been comforting them. They suppress their own developmental needs to preserve attachment. Because attachment is survival for a child, if being fully authentic threatens attachment, authenticity will be sacrificed. This is not a conscious choice. It is a biological imperative. The developing brain prioritizes connection over self-expression, so the child learns to shapeshift. Around one parent, they are quiet and obedient. Around another, they are cheerful and accommodating. At school, they are high-achieving to gain recognition that was missing at home. Yet inside, there is a quiet ache, a sense of not being known. The tragedy of invisibility is not just that others fail to see the child. It is that the child begins to lose sight of themselves. They may struggle to answer simple questions about preferences or desires. What do you enjoy? What do you want? What makes you angry? These questions can feel disorienting because no one helped them develop that inner reference point. Instead, the reference point became external approval. The body carries this story: chronic muscle tension from holding back tears, shallow breathing from bracing against conflict, digestive issues from swallowed emotions. The nervous system remains vigilant long after the original environment has changed. Even in safe relationships, the invisible child, now an adult, may anticipate dismissal or misunderstanding. They may over-explain themselves, apologize excessively, minimize their struggles. They may feel guilty for having needs at all. And yet, beneath the adaptation, there is a remarkable strength. The invisible child developed extraordinary sensitivity. They can sense emotional undercurrents that others miss. They can sit with pain because they have lived with it. They can offer deep compassion because they understand loneliness from the inside. But compassion that flows only outward becomes depletion. Healing begins not by blaming caregivers, but by acknowledging reality. The childless invisibility was not a reflection of their worth. It was a reflection of the limitations and wounds of the adults around them. Many caregivers were themselves unseen as children. They passed down what they knew. Understanding this does not erase the impact, but it softens the shame. When the invisible child begins to turn their attention inward, something unfamiliar happens. They start noticing their own sensations. The tightness in the chest when agreeing to something they do not want. The heaviness in the stomach when suppressing anger. The warmth that arises when they speak honestly. This awareness can feel destabilizing at first. There may be grief for the childhood that was not experienced. Anger for the years spent self-abandoning. Fear that authenticity will lead to rejection. But gradually, the nervous system learns a new possibility. That connection and self-expression do not have to be opposites. That it is possible to remain attached while also remaining true. The invisible child does not need to become someone else to heal. They need to become visible to themselves, to listen without judgment, to validate emotions that were once dismissed, to practice saying no without apology, to tolerate the discomfort of being seen. Because the deepest wound was never sensitivity. It was the belief that their inner world did not matter. And when that belief begins to loosen, the child who once disappeared to survive can finally begin to exist without shrinking. When a child grows up in an unpredictable emotional environment, the nervous system adapts with astonishing intelligence. If a caregiver's mood shifts suddenly, if affection is inconsistent, if anger appears without warning, the child's brain learns that safety depends on anticipation. The body becomes alert not to its own needs, but to the microexpressions, tone changes, and subtle gestures of others. This is hyper-attunement. It is not chosen consciously. It is wired into the developing nervous system as protection. The child discovers that by reading the room accurately, they can avoid conflict, prevent rejection, or soothe distress before it escalates. They become students of human behavior long before they understand their own emotions. Their survival depends on it. In a healthy environment, a child's primary task is exploration, curiosity, play, self-expression. But in a tense or emotionally inconsistent home, the primary task shifts to monitoring. Who is upset? Who is withdrawn? Who is about to explode? The child tracks these signals with precision. Over time, this vigilance becomes automatic. The nervous system lives in a subtle state of activation. The eyes scan faces, the ears sharpen to tonal changes, the body braces in anticipation. Even in calm moments, there is an undercurrent of readiness, because when love feels conditional, the body prepares for loss. Hyper-attuned children often appear mature beyond their years. They are considerate, polite, deeply empathetic. Adults may praise them for being thoughtful or wise. What is not seen is the cost of that wisdom. It was purchased with self-suppression. When attention is constantly directed outward, inward awareness weakens. The child knows exactly when a parent is stressed, but may have no language for their own sadness. They sense tension between adults, but cannot identify their own fear. Their internal signals become background noise compared to the urgency of external cues. This creates a split. The authentic self, with its spontaneous feelings and desires, moves into the background. The adaptive self steps forward. The adaptive self smiles when anxious, agrees when uncomfortable, comforts when depleted. It believes that if others are stable, then survival is secured. In childhood, this belief has logic. Attachment is survival. A child cannot afford emotional exile, so they sacrifice authenticity for connection. They trade self-expression for belonging. The body learns that being needed is safer than having needs. As the child grows into adulthood, hyper-attunement often becomes identity. They are the friend who always understands, the partner who anticipates needs before they are spoken, the colleague who senses workplace tension immediately. Others rely on their emotional radar, yet beneath this competence is exhaustion. Because hyper-attunement is rooted in anxiety, the nervous system rarely fully rests. Even in healthy relationships, there can be a persistent scanning, a searching for subtle signs of withdrawal or disappointment, a tendency to personalize shifts in mood. If someone is quiet, the hyper-attuned individual may assume responsibility. This is the old survival pattern replaying itself. The body does not easily distinguish between past and present. If unpredictability once meant danger, then unpredictability anywhere can trigger the same activation, a delayed text message, a sigh, a change in plans. These moments can spark disproportionate concern. Not because the adult is irrational, but because the child within learned that small signals carried large consequences. There is also grief embedded in hyper-attunement, the grief of not having been attuned to. The child who monitored everyone else often longs, even unconsciously, for someone to monitor them, to ask without being prompted, to notice without explanation, to care without performance. When that longing goes unmet, resentment can quietly build. The hyper-attuned adult may feel unappreciated, overextended, invisible despite the constant giving. They may wonder why relationships feel one-sided, not recognizing that they rarely reveal their own needs clearly, because revealing needs once felt unsafe. Hyper-attunement blurs boundaries. If you are always aware of what others feel, it becomes difficult to separate their emotions from your own. You may absorb anxiety that is not yours, carry responsibility that was never assigned, feel guilty for discomfort that does not belong to you. This is not weakness. It is a nervous system that adapted brilliantly to early conditions. The problem arises when adaptation becomes limitation. What once protected now constrains. The same sensitivity that prevented chaos can prevent authenticity. The same vigilance that preserved attachment can prevent intimacy. Healing does not require becoming less perceptive. It requires recalibrating the nervous system, learning that connection does not demand constant monitoring, practicing noticing internal sensations with the same precision once reserved for others. What am I feeling right now? Where do I feel it in my body? What do I need? These questions may initially feel foreign. The hyper-attuned mind may immediately redirect outward. But with gentle repetition, attention can slowly turn inward. The body begins to experience moments of rest. The shoulders soften. The breath deepens. The eyes no longer scan every room for threat. Safety becomes internal rather than dependent on managing others. And something remarkable happens. When hyper-attunement is no longer driven by fear, it transforms. It becomes true empathy rather than anxious vigilance. It becomes choice rather than compassion. The individual can sense others deeply without abandoning themselves in the process. Survival strategies are not flaws. They are evidence of resilience. But survival is not the same as living. And the journey of the hyper-attuned soul is a journey from constant monitoring to grounded presence, from scanning for danger to inhabiting the body, from earning connection through vigilance to allowing connection through authenticity. Chronic self-abandonment does not happen in a single dramatic moment. It unfolds quietly, subtly, often beginning in childhood when authenticity feels risky and attachment feels fragile. It is not a decision a child consciously makes. It is an adaptation shaped by necessity. When a child senses that expressing certain emotions leads to withdrawal, criticism, or tension, they learn to edit themselves. If anger disrupts connection, anger is suppressed. If sadness burdens a caregiver, sadness is hidden. If joy is dismissed, excitement is toned down. The child begins to prioritize belonging over truth. At first, this seems small, a swallowed protest, a forced smile, a quick apology. But over time, these moments accumulate. The child becomes practiced at overriding internal signals. The body says no, but the mouth says yes. The heart feels hurt, but the face remains composed. The nervous system tightens, yet the child insists they are fine. Self-abandonment becomes a way of preserving love. For a developing brain, attachment equals survival. Losing connection feels life-threatening. So the child as system makes a trade. Authenticity is sacrificed to maintain proximity. The tragedy is that this trade often continues long after the original threat has passed. As the child grows into adulthood, the pattern feels normal. They may not even recognize it as self-abandonment. They call it being considerate, flexible, easygoing. They pride themselves on being low maintenance. They tell themselves they do not ask for much. Yet beneath the identity is a chronic disconnection from the self. Chronic self-abandonment shows up in subtle ways, agreeing to commitments that create resentment, staying silent during moments of disrespect, prioritizing others, comfort over personal well-being, ignoring fatigue, dismissing intuition, minimizing pain. The body keeps a record of each override. Tension settles into muscles. The jaw tightens from unspoken words. The stomach churns from swallowed boundaries. Sleep becomes restless because the nervous system remains alert to others' needs. Anxiety grows, not because life is inherently chaotic, but because the self has been consistently sidelined. There's open confusion in these individuals. They feel exhausted yet cannot pinpoint why. They feel unseen yet struggle to reveal themselves. They long for deeper intimacy but fear that honesty will push people away. This fear has history. In early life, authenticity may indeed have threatened connection. A parent overwhelmed by their own struggles may have responded with irritation or withdrawal when confronted with the child. Strong emotions. The child internalized a message. My feelings are too much. My needs are inconvenient. My truth disrupts stability. And so stability became the priority. Chronic self-abandonment is not weakness. It is loyalty. Loyalty to relationships. Loyalty to early survival strategies. Loyalty to the belief that love must be maintained at any cost. But the cost is high. Over time, resentment can quietly accumulate. Not because others are intentionally exploitative, but because the individual rarely communicates limits clearly. When needs remain unspoken, they remain unmet. When boundaries are implied but not asserted, they are crossed without awareness. A self-abandoning person may feel invisible, yet they have participated in their own invisibility. This realization can bring shame. It is important to approach it with compassion. The pattern was never about inadequacy. It was about safety. The nervous system once believed that self-erasure prevented loss. Healing begins with awareness. Awareness of the subtle moment when the body contracts before agreeing to something. Awareness of irritation that signals a crossed boundary. Awareness of fatigue that indicates depletion. These signals are invitations, not inconveniences. At first, responding to them feels terrifying. Saying no may trigger guilt. Expressing hurt may provoke anxiety. Setting a boundary may awaken the old fear of abandonment. The nervous system reacts as though survival is at stake, because at one time it was. The work is not to force bold declarations overnight. The work is to build tolerance for authenticity in small increments, to pause before automatic agreement, to check in with the body, to experiment with gentle honesty, to allow discomfort without immediately retreating into compliance. Chronic self-abandonment heals through repeated experiences of safe self-expression. When someone responds with respect rather than rejection, the nervous system updates its expectations. When a boundary strengthens a relationship rather than destroying it, the old narrative weakens. When rest is honored without catastrophe, the body learns that worth is not tied to productivity. There may also be grief. Grief for the years spent accommodating. Grief for the child who believed they had to disappear to be loved. Grief for the relationships shaped by imbalance. This grief is not regression, it is integration, because self-abandonment fragments identity. Parts of the self remain underdeveloped, desires unexplored, anger unprocessed, preferences undefined. Healing involves reclaiming these exiled parts and welcoming them without judgment. It means asking questions that once felt forbidden. What do I want? What do I feel? What do I need? And then allowing the answers to matter. The paradox is that true connection deepens when self-abandonment ends. Authenticity invites mutuality. Boundaries create clarity. Needs expressed openly allow others to respond consciously rather than guess. Chronic self-abandonment once ensured attachment. In adulthood, it often prevents intimacy. The journey forward is not about becoming rigid or self-centered. It is about restoring balance, about recognizing that care flowing outward must also flow inward, about understanding that love built on self-erasure is fragile, but love grounded in truth is resilient. The person who has long abandoned themselves may fear they are asking for too much. In reality, they are finally asking for enough. The body keeps the score in ways the mind often refuses to acknowledge. Long after events have faded from conscious memory, the nervous system continues to carry their imprint. Experiences that were overwhelming, silenced, or minimized do not disappear simply because they were endured. They are stored in muscle tension, breathing patterns, posture, immune responses, and the subtle chemistry of stress hormones circulating through the bloodstream. A child who grows up in emotional unpredictability may learn to suppress visible reactions. Tears are swallowed, anger is restrained, fear is hidden behind compliance. On the surface, the child appears calm or mature. Inside, however, the body remains activated. The heart rate quickens in response to raised voices. The stomach tightens before conflict. Shoulders lift defensively at subtle signs of disapproval. When these responses happen repeatedly, they become ingrained. The nervous system wires itself around vigilance. It learns that safety depends on anticipation. Even in adulthood, when the original environment has changed, the body reacts as if the past is still present. This is not weakness. It is physiology. The stress response is designed for short bursts of survival. It mobilizes energy to fight, flee, or freeze. But when stress is chronic and unresolved, the body never fully returns to baseline. Cortisol remains elevated. Muscles stay contracted. Sleep becomes shallow. Digestion is compromised because the system prioritizes protection over restoration. The individual may not consciously feel anxious. They may describe themselves as functional, responsible, capable. Yet their body tells a different story. Frequent headaches, autoimmune flare-ups, persistent fatigue, unexplained pain. These symptoms are often treated as isolated malfunctions rather than messages. The body speaks in sensation when words were not permitted. When emotions are consistently invalidated, the brain learns to disconnect from them. This disconnection may provide temporary relief. If you cannot feel anger, you do not risk expressing it. If you numb sadness, you avoid appearing vulnerable. But emotional suppression does not eliminate the physiological charge. It simply buries it. The buried charge accumulates. Over time, the person may develop a limited emotional vocabulary. They know they are stressed, but cannot differentiate between grief, resentment, or fear. The mind categorizes everything as fine or overwhelming. Meanwhile, the body continues reacting with precision to cues that resemble earlier experiences, a tone of voice that echoes a critical parent, a subtle withdrawal from a partner, a workplace authority figure expressing disappointment. The body tightens instantly, even if the conscious mind rationalizes the situation as minor. This gap between intellectual understanding and physical reaction can feel confusing. Why am I reacting so strongly? Why can I not relax? Because the body remembers what the mind has normalized. Trauma is not defined only by dramatic events. It is also shaped by chronic emotional misattunement, by not being comforted when distressed, by having to manage a caregiver as emotions, by feeling unseen. These experiences may not be labeled as trauma, yet the nervous system encodes them as threat. The immune system responds accordingly. Chronic stress disrupts inflammation regulation. Hormonal balance shifts. The gut, deeply connected to emotional processing, becomes sensitive. The body is not betraying the individual. It is attempting to communicate unresolved strain. Many people attempt to override these signals with productivity. They push through exhaustion, ignore pain, silence anxiety with distraction. In doing so, they reinforce the original pattern of self-abandonment. The body, as protests grow louder, eventually symptoms demand attention. Healing begins not with force, but with listening. Listening to fatigue as information rather than laziness. Listening to tension as a boundary indicator. Listening to anxiety as a signal of perceived threat rather than personal failure. This requires slowing down enough to notice subtle sensations. Breath is often the first doorway. Chronic stress produces shallow breathing that keeps the body in alert mode. Gentle awareness of breath begins to soften the nervous system. Muscles release incrementally, the heart rate steadies. Safety is communicated internally rather than sought externally. Emotions may surface as physical awareness increases. Grief felt as heaviness in the chest, anger as heat in the arms, fear as fluttering in the abdomen. Allowing these sensations without immediate suppression rewires the system. The body learns that feelings can move through without catastrophe. Compassion is essential in this process. The body adapted intelligently to survive early conditions. Its hyper-vigilance was protective. Its tension was defensive. Its numbness was strategic. Criticizing these adaptations only deepens internal conflict. Instead, curiosity replaces judgment. What is this pain protecting? What memory might this tension hold? What need was never acknowledged? As awareness grows, the body gradually updates its expectations. Safe relationships challenge old predictions. Rest without punishment recalibrates stress hormones. Boundaries expressed without rejection create new neural pathways. The nervous system begins to distinguish past from present. This does not happen instantly. The body trusts slowly because it learns slowly. There may be periods of discomfort as suppressed material surfaces, tears without clear narrative, sudden waves of anger, unexpected fatigue. These are not signs of regression. They are signs of thawing, because when the body has carried unprocessed emotion for years, release can feel unfamiliar. The individual might need support to navigate these sensations without retreating into old patterns of suppression. Over time, a new relationship forms between mind and body. Sensations become guidance rather than inconvenience. Fatigue prompts rest. Tightness signals misalignment. Calm becomes recognizable and sustainable. The body no longer needs to shout because it has been heard in whispers. The score it kept was never meant as punishment. It was a record of survival, waiting patiently for acknowledgement. Boundaries and authenticity are often misunderstood as acts of defiance or rejection, especially by those who learned early in life that love depended on compliance. For many sensitive individuals, the idea of setting boundaries feels dangerous. It carries the old fear that saying no will lead to disconnection, disappointment, or abandonment. So they learn to stay agreeable, flexible, accommodating. They convince themselves that harmony is more important than honesty. But harmony built on self-silencing is fragile. Authenticity begins with recognizing internal truth. It is the quiet awareness of what feels aligned and what does not. It is noticing when the body contracts in response to a request. It is acknowledging irritation instead of immediately dismissing it. Yet for someone who grew up prioritizing others' emotional needs, this internal awareness can feel unfamiliar or even selfish. The nervous system equates boundary setting with threat because, at one time, it may have been. A child who challenged a caregiver might have been ignored, criticized, or emotionally withdrawn from. The lesson becomes deeply embedded. Do not upset the connection. Do not disrupt stability. Adapt instead. So adaptation becomes identity. In adulthood, this pattern shows up as chronic overcommitment, agreeing to social plans despite exhaustion, taking on responsibilities that breed resentment, remaining silent during moments of subtle disrespect. The individual may tell themselves they are being kind, yet beneath the surface there is a quiet erosion of self-trust. Because every time the body signals discomfort and the mind overrides it, authenticity weakens. Boundaries are not walls. They are information. They communicate where one person ends and another begins. Without them, relationships become blurred. Emotional labor becomes uneven. Resentment accumulates silently. The person who never says no eventually feels unseen, yet they have participated in their own invisibility. This realization requires compassion rather than blame. The absence of boundaries was once protective. It preserved attachment. It reduced conflict. It created predictability in unpredictable environments. The nervous system does not easily relinquish strategies that once ensured survival. Authenticity asks for courage. It asks for tolerating discomfort in the present to prevent deeper suffering in the future. It asks for trusting that connection can withstand honesty. This trust may not feel natural at first. It must be practiced gradually. The first boundary is often internal. It is the pause before automatic agreement. It is asking, what do I actually feel about this? It is allowing space between request and response. This pause interrupts the old reflex of compliance. When an external boundary is expressed, guilt often follows. Guilt does not necessarily mean wrongdoing. It often signals a shift away from familiar patterns. The nervous system interprets the unfamiliar as unsafe. Staying steady through that guilt rewires expectation. Authenticity does not require harshness. It can be gentle and firm simultaneously. A simple statement of truth without excessive explanation. A clear no without apology layered in self-criticism. A request articulated calmly. These small acts accumulate and reshape relational dynamics. There may be resistance from others who benefited from the absence of boundaries. They may express surprise or discomfort. This reaction can trigger the old fear of rejection. It is important to remember that someone else discomfort does not equal danger. Discomfort is part of growth. When authenticity is practiced consistently, something shifts internally. Self-respect strengthens. The body relaxes because it no longer needs to carry unspoken resentment. Energy previously spent on people-pleasing becomes available for creativity, rest, and genuine connection. Authenticity also deepens intimacy. When needs are spoken, relationships gain clarity. Others are given the opportunity to respond consciously rather than guess. Mutuality becomes possible. Connection becomes a choice rather than an obligation. For those who equated boundaries with abandonment, this transformation can feel profound. They begin to experience that saying no does not automatically dissolve love, that disagreement does not inevitably lead to loss, that they can remain connected without disappearing. There is grief in this process as well. Grief for the years spent shape-shifting. Grief for relationships maintained through self-erasure. Grief for the child who believed their truth was too disruptive to share. Allowing this grief without self-judgment is part of integration. Boundaries are not about controlling others. They are about honoring internal limits. They are about recognizing that empathy without self-protection becomes depletion. They are about understanding that authenticity is not aggression but alignment. As the nervous system learns that truth does not equal catastrophe, expression becomes more natural. The voice steadies, the body softens, decisions feel clearer, the constant mental rehearsal of others. Reactions diminishes because self-trust replaces external approval as the primary guide. Authenticity is not a fixed state. It is an ongoing practice of returning to oneself. It requires listening inward with the same sensitivity once directed exclusively outward. It requires valuing internal signals as legitimate data rather than inconveniences. In time, boundaries feel less like barriers and more like bridges. They create defined spaces where connection can flourish without resentment. They allow love to be freely given, rather than extracted through obligation. The person who once feared that honesty would cost them belonging begins to discover something unexpected. That belonging grounded in authenticity feels steadier than belonging earned through self-abandonment. That relationships rooted in clarity are more resilient than those maintained through silent sacrifice. And slowly, the old equation begins to dissolve. Connection no longer demands disappearance. Love no longer requires self-betrayal. The individual stands present in their own life, not hardened, not withdrawn, but integrated. Sensitive yet steady, open yet defined. Connected yet whole. Healing through compassionate awareness does not begin with fixing. It begins with noticing. For many who have lived in survival mode, the instinct is to correct themselves, to discipline emotions, to analyze patterns until they make intellectual sense. But awareness that is harsh only deepens the wound. True healing requires a different quality of attention, one that is patient, curious, and kind. Compassionate awareness means turning toward your inner experience without immediately trying to change it. It is the act of observing anxiety without labeling it weakness. It is feeling sadness without calling it dramatic. It is recognizing anger without condemning it as wrong. This stance may feel unfamiliar, especially for those who learned early that certain emotions were unacceptable. As children, many learn to monitor themselves through the imagined eyes of others. They internalized criticism before it was spoken. They judged their tears. They silenced their frustration. Over time, this inner critic became automatic. It promised protection through perfection. If you can manage yourself flawlessly, you will avoid rejection. But perfection is not safety. It is tension. Compassionate awareness interrupts this pattern. Instead of asking what is wrong with me, it asks what happened to me. Instead of demanding immediate improvement, it asks what this feeling might be protecting. The shift is subtle yet profound. The nervous system responds differently to curiosity than it does to judgment. When the body senses criticism, it tightens. When it senses acceptance, it softens. This softening is not indulgence. It is regulation. A regulated nervous system can process emotion. A shamed nervous system can only defend against it. So healing becomes less about controlling reactions and more about creating internal safety. Internal safety begins in small moments. Noticing the clench in the jaw during conflict. Observing the heaviness in the chest after disappointment, recognizing the impulse to say yes when the body wants to say no. These observations are made without immediate correction. They are simply acknowledged. I see you. For someone accustomed to self-abandonment, this acknowledgement can feel radical. It challenges the lifelong habit of dismissing internal signals. It invites presence where there was once avoidance. It allows grief to surface without rushing it away. Grief is often central to healing. Grief for unmet needs. Grief for the childhood that required adaptation. Grief for relationships shaped by self-erasure. Compassionate awareness does not bypass this pain. It creates space for it. It says that sorrow makes sense, that anger has roots, that fear once served a purpose. Understanding the purpose of past adaptations reduces shame. Hypervigilance once ensured safety. Compliance once preserved attachment. Emotional suppression once prevented conflict. When these strategies are viewed as intelligent responses rather than character flaws, the inner battle quiets. The body begins to trust this new relationship. Compassionate awareness also involves responsibility but not blame. Responsibility means recognizing patterns without condemning oneself for having them. It means noticing when old habits resurface and gently redirecting attention. It means practicing boundaries even when guilt arises. It means staying present with discomfort rather than escaping into distraction. There will be resistance. The nervous system prefers familiarity, even if familiarity is painful. Growth can feel destabilizing. Moments of clarity may be followed by regression. This does not signal failure. It signals integration and progress. Healing is rarely linear. Some days awareness feels spacious and steady. Other days it feels fragile. The key is consistency of attitude rather than consistency of outcome. Returning again and again to gentle observation. Returning again and again to self-kindness. Relationships often shift as compassionate awareness deepens. Tolerance for imbalance decreases. The individual may begin expressing needs more clearly. They may step back from dynamics that once felt obligatory. This can evoke anxiety, especially if identity was built around being indispensable. Yet compassionate awareness reminds them that worth is inherent, not earned through sacrifice. As internal attunement strengthens, external validation loses its grip. Decisions become guided by alignment rather than approval. The body serves as compass. A sense of expansion signals resonance. Contraction signals reconsideration. Listening becomes embodied rather than purely cognitive. There is humility in this process. An acknowledgement that the self is layered and complex. That healing does not mean eliminating vulnerability. It means relating to vulnerability differently. It means offering oneself the empathy that was once directed exclusively outward. Over time, compassionate awareness reshapes identity. The individual no longer sees themselves as broken or overly sensitive. They begin to recognize sensitivity as perception. They understand that emotions are data. They trust that discomfort can be navigated without collapse. This trust is built through repeated experiences of staying present, sitting with fear until it subsides naturally, allowing anger to inform boundaries, letting sadness move through without suppression. Each experience updates the nervous system's expectations. Safety becomes internalized. Healing through compassionate awareness does not promise a life without pain. It offers a life without chronic self-betrayal. It replaces automatic judgment with deliberate care. It transforms survival strategies into conscious choices. And in that steady practice of turning toward oneself with patience and respect, the fragmented parts begin to integrate. The unseen child feels acknowledged. The hypervigilant protector feels appreciated. The authentic self feels permission to emerge. Compassion becomes not just something offered to others, but the ground upon which one stands.